am 𝗂𝗂𝗁, metaphysical master in a millennial age, and it is my life's purpose to guide you and organizations along an enlightened path. So I invite you to sit comfortably and tune in as I welcome you to the Meta Business Millennial, where we get the real conversations you won't get in the boardroom so that we understand this is exactly the path we need to be on in order to grow, evolve, and thrive. Greetings, y'all. I am 𝗂𝗂𝗁, also known as Master L, and welcome to today's very special live episode of the Meta Business Millennial podcast. I am live across platforms, y'all: Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And I couldn't be happier to be with you all today because, there is just so much going on in the world, so much going on in our lives that just needs to be talked about. And I'm so happy to see people already filling up in the room. Faces that familiar names and not so familiar names. So welcome, everyone. If you haven't already, I invite you to follow me at I am 𝗂𝗂𝗁 across social media platforms. And of course, share this video, like it, leave me a comment, shoot me a DM, especially if this particular message today resonates with you. And you guys, I can't get to the conversation fast enough. That's why I feel like I'm stumbling through my intro, because I'm like, I can't wait to talk about today's topic. It's the hottest tea. And also it's so, I believe, relative and relatable for Black women. And I spoke about this on my last episode, that a lot more of my content, a lot more of the direction I'm going is really focused on the Black woman professional, the Black woman entrepreneur, and women of color in general who are wanting to make their name, make their mark in this world, and do it in alignment with the highest, in the highest way, in the highest form, with love, with compassion. And so with that, we really need to explore a lot of different topics, dissect a lot of different business leaders and leaders, and understand where they fell short or where they didn't quite, complete the whole picture, so that we can learn from their mistakes and not make them. And it couldn't be a better, verse to quote than JayZ when he said, "𝗘𝗶𝘁𝗵 did that, so you don't have to go through that." I mean, JayZ said it himself, okay, guys? And now we're about to explore today's topic around what JayZ has done, so we don't have to go through that, okay? And I thank him for teaching us these very valuable lessons. And in this case, unfortunately, it's at the expense of someone else and at the harm being done to someone else, particularly a woman. And so I want to first kind of frame the conversation, because let me just pull this up for y'all to see that JayZ has been accused in a civil lawsuit of raping a 13-year-old girl in 2000, along with Sean Diddy Combs. And it says here that JayZ responded with a lengthy statement calling the allegations idiotic, while the accuser remains anonymous. And, this is from today, and, a very reputable mainstream source, and it's an exclusive reporting. And I said I wanted to start with caveating my, own personal journey with JayZ, because I feel like, we've heard this stuff in the news. And like I talked about in a previous podcast episode about Diddy and toxic fame, I particularly grew up really admiring JayZ, high-key idolizing him. And, there couldn't have been a bigger fan in JayZ than me. And anyone that knows me, and especially knew me like high school, college, my time in New York, like I knew every JayZ lyric, every JayZ, freestyle, went to every JayZ concert. I was a JayZ fanatic. And I remember as I was going through my own healing journey and starting to really reconcile what these, lyrics meant to me, because I've talked about this before, that a lot of the music that we listen to are mantras and can also be deadly lyrics. I've spoken about this before on the previous same podcast and on Toxic Fame. And it was my realization of all the things that I was saying, all the things that he particularly was, storytelling and narrating were very deadly lyrics, and really kind of shaped my mind around what I should be going after ambitiously in my life. Very materially focused, very money driven, status driven, particularly. And I really started to embody a lot of that, which was portrayed in his lyrics. And so I wanted to frame it with this, because I feel like in many ways I was like made for this opportunity to really kind of dive deeply into exploring what JayZ is, who he is, what his life has looked like. Even last year, y'all, I went to his exhibit at the Brooklyn Library and was frankly appalled by how one-dimensional it was. Like, in my view, JayZ is like a prolific rapper, an executive producer, an executive businessman. He's owned basketball teams. Like, he's done a lot of things, but a large portion of that exhibit really was framed around him being a gangster, being from the projects, being a drug dealer, a killer, all of those things. And to me, what we've seen in the past 20 years plus, he's been none of those things, but a wealthy individual who's making music. And so, we're going to get a little bit more deeper into what this means, but I just wanted to continue to frame my own personal, reaction to and connection to this story, and why it's so meaningful to me in this time. Because as I was kind of going again through my spiritual journey and really starting to unpack these lyrics and what I viewed as, entertainment versus reality, I really started to get angry at JayZ, and kind of like see him for who he was. And I want to play another clip as we begin to frame out this conversation, because these are things that were missed upon us, in those days where we were really blinded by, the Jigga Man and the bling and, the fame and the fortune. But, he has really been showing us his nature from the beginning. And so I really wanted to show this video with him and his interaction with Rihanna when she won her first Grammy. So I'm just going to let this play. And
Dad, I know I promised you I'm going to give you my first Grammy, but we might have to fight for this one.
She said she want to thank everybody for her first Grammy.
Anyway, I'd like to thank JayZ for being a part of this record with me.
She like to thank Jigga Man for being the greatest in the world.
Ellen Reed, Steve Bartles, Tata, Jay Brown, Karen Kwok for finding this amazing record. Tricky Dream for writing such a beautiful record. Thank you, I love you guys. Mom, Dad, my two brothers, Rory and Rajad. Please wrap up, okay? Barbados, I love you. We got one. Evan Rogers, Carl Sturken, Mark Jordan, Krista, making sure I don't forget anybody. Thank you so much. This means a lot.
Whew. Okay, guys. I just had to breathe through that, because that popped up on my timeline maybe a month or two ago, and it was actually posted, I think, on that platform that I saw it like back in October. So there was some little trickles of kind of what was coming in terms of JayZ and his character. And as we can see very clearly in that video with Rihanna, his power over energy, if you will. And I'm going to get a little bit more, explain what this power over is. But clearly, like, JayZ at that time, likely in his late 30s, early 40s, this is a young teenage girl. And, he is really encroaching on her moment to shine, making sure that she honors and worships him, And so this is not, surprising coming from, what we're seeing in terms of the rape allegations, and with Diddy's allegations too, in terms of how they use their power and influence to control and dominate, their artists, and continue to, in many ways rape them financially and reap, benefits from their talents, their ignorance, and their naivety. And this, as we know, runs rampant through the music industry. So I'm not necessarily blaming these two guys for being this in the music industry, but they're in the news, so we're talking about it, okay? And so that brings me to sort of the next aspect of why JayZ and Diddy are the way they are. Why are JayZ and Diddy these dominant, aggressive, in many ways violent individuals? Well, let's go back to their childhood, because everything that we are as adults starts as young people. And we, in many ways, can, I've done a lot of research on both these men because of my admiration, like I said, and love for them, particularly at a very young age. So I've watched every documentary and every interview, particularly on JayZ. So I'm very familiar with his upbringing, particularly in the Marcy Projects in Brooklyn. He alludes to this a lot in his lyrics. And I remember one particular interview he had done with the New York Times, or I believe it was the New York Times on Netflix. And he was talking about, like, this was kind of after his 444 album, and he was trying to do a little bit more healing around his past. And he had spoken about when he was in the projects, how even just walking by another individual, if you look them in the eye, that could be almost like fighting or a killing opportunity, because you would see someone, you would see their pain, you would see their hurt, you would see what they're going through. And so you wouldn't even look people in the eye in the projects, And I lived in New York for several years. I've been to the projects. Even in Third Ward, my mother grew up in the projects, CUNY homes in Houston, but they're vastly different from projects in New York, particularly Brooklyn in the 70s and 80s, when these men, Diddy grew up in Harlem, JayZ Brooklyn, but much of the energy was still the same. A lot of violence, a lot of poverty, a lot of abuses, and a deep, deep insecurity and sense of self. And so when you're really understanding sort of the becoming of a man that JayZ is, then you have to look at who he was raised as a child. And he even spoke about, like, his mother having lots of kids and being by herself and struggling in the projects, and he had to go out in the street and hustle. And so fundamentally, the hustling game is a poison to the very community in which it is in. We all are familiar with crackheads, particularly in the Black community. Black women know this, and Black women have experienced it growing up, people in their families that were addicted to crack or addicted to drugs and what that is. And then he is on the side of fueling those addictions and really, like I said, poisoning a community in his teens. So already the normalization of harming someone so I can get ahead is established and programmed and acceptable and rewarded. It's rewarded with money. It's rewarded with material things. Like he said, all the wavy light-skinned girls loving me now. He's driving a nice car. All the girls love him because he's making money off of other people's pains, addictions, and trauma at teenage years. So again, we're understanding sort of why a JayZ is the way he is. We must look at where he comes from, his environment, who he was surrounded by, what nurtured him, who taught him. The Streets is watching. We remember that album. They turned it into a movie. The Streets were his school. And this fundamentally is what we glorify in hip hop music. And I was talking about this too, in terms of just how I'm going to continue to service, this new Black consciousness is really coming to grips with how much we idolize and value and accept street culture as acceptable. The violence, the abuses, the getting ahead by any means necessary, by any way possible, taking from others, killing others. And I know many of you, particularly Black women, grew up in situations, and even though I grew up in a more middle-class professional family, like I had family members that were murdered. My very own sister murdered, murdered for, a crime of passion, but I had cousins that were murdered for starter jackets, Jordans, you know what I'm saying? The most absurd things you can think about. I'm literally like shaking right now talking about this stuff because it's really a powerful acknowledgement of what we had to survive in order to be even standing here today. So that's why I say there is no judgment cast upon JayZ. There's no judgment cast upon Diddy, because you have to understand where they come from. And, I want to also acknowledge too, because they're like, well, Aaron, they have so much money, they're so successful. But this is the time when we need to start understanding what money is and actually questioning, what is the value of money to me? Because if it requires me to dominate someone, to abuse someone, to rape someone, then is that money really worth it? Yeah, JayZ now can call himself a billionaire, but how much money is it going to take him to clean up his reputation, to clear up his name? I'm sure many of you saw his beautiful daughter, Blue Ivy. She's now in a Lion King film or doing something along her career. And literally on the day she's like on the red carpet, we're talking about JayZ's rape allegations, her father's rape allegations. I don't think anybody would desire that, no matter how rich they are. You can't pay to fix that. And I feel like, this is an opportunity to really start to move into what we can learn from this. Because, I've talked a lot about kind of why they are the way they are and their programming, their upbringing, particularly Diddy and JayZ, and JayZ's upbringings more specifically, and why he is the way he is. And, him also starting the music industry at such a young age. He was in his 20s, even though he didn't pop, until his late 20s, his early 30s, but he was really in the music industry, Diddy too, working for Uptown Records as a teenager. They really were starting to be acknowledged and recognized, not just rewarded, but acknowledged and recognized for their behaviors. So it then becomes triply acceptable to be this way, to be ruthless, to be violent, to be dominant, because now I get to be starting my own record label, a partner at a record label. I'm chummy right with Clive Davis. That was Diddy's path. And JayZ very similarly started his own record label. Him and Dame Dash, they say they funded it from street money, and started their own record label, Rockefeller Records. And so these are young people coming out of a very trauma-filled upbringing and then capitalizing on these experiences, being rewarded for these experiences, recognized for these traumatic experiences, and then recognized, rewarded, and then accepted across the globe for these very traumatic experiences, celebrated for these very traumatic experiences. And so these then become ours. And that to me is why I was saying in the beginning, when I started to unpack my spiritual path and what I had been programmed, why I got so angry is how I just so, unconsciously allowed these very traumatic experiences to become my own. Rapping these lyrics about, Satan and killing and drugs and all these things. I mean, you name a rapper, and this is what the content most likely will be. And so with that, we have to start to look at ourselves. As with everything, we can point fingers, we can look at other people. We can blame them, we can judge them, but at the end of the day, what's our role in this? How do we learn from the mistakes of people like a JayZ and Diddy? What does that mean for us? And so I started with, on the JayZ side, his childhood. And I want to bring that back for us, particularly as Black women. What have we experienced in our childhoods that we've ignored or suppressed that was hard or painful? And I don't want to always use the word trauma or traumatic because I realize that can also be very off-putting and dramatic, if you will. So we must, though, start to look at ourselves, look at our past, and then start to observe that part of ourselves. Like, that's the first step, is the acknowledgement and the observation without judgment. And how that looked like for me particularly, I really started doing inner child work, I would say about 5 years ago. And it really looked like me going back, telling my story over and over again. And I continue to tell my story over and over again, but then trying to rewrite that story from the lens of a creator instead of a victim. Because there was so much about my life that was out of my control, but deeply impacted me and also made me the incredible person that I am today. Same for you. Same for you, sis. That your experiences, once you observe them, whether you're journaling about it, a great journal prompt is, thinking about like, what was my childhood like? What were some of the joys and pains of my childhood, and kind of writing through those things. And if you don't already have someone who you're talking to, like a therapist or, someone like a coach like me, or someone who you can really, talk through these things out with and get the healing out that you need to get out of it, you can start with yourself. If it's not comfortable for you to share, then you definitely can write it out in a journal and really start to explore, okay, these things happened and why they happen. Am I judging myself for these things? And, could I have, done anything differently? Because these are real questions, because sometimes in our child mind, we process things a little bit off because we only have such a certain level of consciousness and understanding about the world in general. So there was a long time where I was so ashamed to tell people that my dad went to prison when I was 6 and my sister was murdered, a few months before he went away, because I felt like it was me. I felt like it was, something that I had done. So there was a lot of shame around even sharing those things because I felt responsible. And so we have to start to really unpack, like, what is really me? What is my fault? What can I be blamed for? Or what actually was out of my control that I internalized as my own? And, as we start to do this work, we really begin to see, how innocent we are, how pure we are, because that's also part of the journey, is really unpacking and allowing that beautiful inner you, that little girl you, to be free from the prison that we've really kind of built around her to protect her, of course. But a lot of times our protection has been a little bit warped because of our experiences that were not the best experiences, that were not the most joyful experiences. So we can keep her locked away and protecting her from things that actually could be safe for us or could be enjoyable for us. And, another thing that I would love to explore, particularly for Black women as it relates to this story around JayZ, is around sexual trauma. Because of course, a lot of these allegations are around rape like as we saw with Rihanna, like domination, of a power position, a masculine dominant power position. Like he literally owns her as her record label exec, and in her money, in her access to money, in her access to privilege. And so what in our lives, and these are exercises that I've had to do too, where we feel abused, whether sexually, emotionally, mentally, and explore those, observe those as well. Whether it's through journal prompts, like I said, through talk therapy, through coaching, really start to prioritize these experiences where you felt dominated, this power over, and maybe even explore situations where you felt like you were the one dominating or being the abuser. And I feel like that's something that we don't really talk about much. And as a mother, I see it a lot in my behavior because Harlow to me is obviously my child. And because of my I'm still a work in progress, like healing my wounds, my childhood wounds. I definitely dominate, use power over techniques to get him to do what I need him to do. And that's not the way of the future. And the way of the future, I've spoken about this before, is the power with as opposed to power over. And when we're moving in power with, it's generally an opportunity for both to learn from each other, to communicate effectively, to communicate openly, transparently. And there is a very healthy trust there. That is a power with dynamic. And when we're generally in sexually abusive situations or emotionally abusive situations, as I have been in multiple relationships, learning lessons, but at the same time, these were opportunities where I felt so small and so unseen that it was literally impossible for me to talk to anybody about these experiences. And I mean, look at me now, I'm just barely having the courage and the openness to share about these experiences, or that I even had these experiences. And so many Black women I know are hiding. You know, I know we had the Me Too movement, and it was meant to kind of open up more of these conversations around sexual abuse. But where is the healing in that? You know, there is the acknowledgement of it, which is a beautiful first step. But this next step is the healing, and really starting to observe how it went, observe what it is, and how you can be free from it today. How I can free myself from these power over dynamics today, and how I can embody more of the power with dynamics that serve myself and serve my family and all the people around me. And I want to just put a plug here for those of you who have experienced, severe trauma, whether it's sexual trauma, emotional trauma, physical trauma, to certainly DM me. I'm happy to have an open and honest conversation with you about it in a safe space, whether we can schedule like a Zoom call or a phone call and talk about it, because, this is an opportunity to really begin the healing. And I've kind of given you all a first step in terms of the observation, but obviously there has to be work done to really heal and resolve those wounds so you can move forward in power and peace, so you can be able to not repeat those same harmful patterns that have been put on you. And essentially that's what we've seen with someone like JayZ. Like he was raised in an environment where there was power dominance, where there was violence, where there was abuses. So all he did was repeat those same traumatic, violent behaviors, and had a whole lot of money and spotlight and shiny bling to make it look good. That's all that was. And so, I just want to kind of start wrapping up there. This was a very kind of serious topic, but certainly a necessary one for us to really start to unpack as Black women our roles in our healing, unpack as Black women how we can be better leaders than those that have come before us, and learn from 𝗘𝗶𝘁. So he did that, so we don't have to go through that. We want to be able to grow higher and stronger and better than that which came before us, because we deserve it. We have the right to be that. And so, again, I want to encourage you all that are experiencing any trauma or abuses in your life to DM me or email me at Erin at aaronpatton.com. And we can certainly talk more deeply about healing opportunities for you. And with that, I just want to thank you all so much for listening and really tuning in to this very special episode. We will be back next week live with more juicy topics and more trending topics. If there's something that is of interest to you to explore, certainly send that to me as well. I would love to hear from you guys around that, and how we can continue as Black women to rise in our consciousness, rise in our love, and rise in our collective support for one another. So thank you all so much. Much love and light. Peace. Did you really love this episode of the Meta Business Millennial Podcast? Well, I am honored, and I appreciate you subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing it with your friends, because your feedback allows us to co-create more enlightened conversations. And if you're interested in growing your soul now, head over to my website, aaronpatton.com, to find all the show notes, links, and free resources to get your energy activated today. In the meantime, stay bright, my friends. Much love and light. Peace.